For Mr. Tonga, but that Mr. Tonga's phone was switched off. Mr. Mlomba eventually got hold of Mr. Tonga and informed him that, quote, "These guys are looking for gloves," end quote. He explained that this related to an earlier request from Mr. Kwabe on the Saturday morning to inform him that they wanted gloves so as not to leave any fingerprints behind. In my view, the evidence presented in this case falls far below this threshold. In the circumstances, I make the following order. The application in terms of Section 174 of the Criminal Procedure Act is granted. The accused is found not guilty on this charge, and Mr. Mlombo is not granted indemnity from prosecution. Court will adjourn.
There we have it. Shrien Dewani not guilty of the murder charges against him. That decision just announced there after a very long summing up from the judge, who went through all of the evidence, all of the details that had been given in court before announcing that Shrien Dewani is not guilty. Andrew Plant is outside the court in Cape Town. Andrew, quite a decision.
Yeah, so there we are, all those accusations, the suspicions that have been hanging over the head of Shrien Dewani for the past 4 years evaporated in the space of one sentence. Shrien Dewani not guilty. The judge saying the evidence that she's heard over the course of this 7-week trial here in Cape Town simply didn't reach the bar for her to be able to let the case continue, for there to be anything like a realistic prospect of prosecution. She has thrown the whole thing out. Shrien Dewani essentially then is free to go. We've just seen him head straight down the steps that lead into the cells below the courtroom here. No doubt he will then be driven out of the car park the same way he's been going in throughout this trial, in a blacked out car, straight away gone round the corner, so you don't actually see him coming or going. But an explosive decision for him and his family, the one they had been hoping to hear today. Also terrible news for Annie Dewani's family, of course. They made a public appeal here last week to the judge to allow this trial to continue. Essentially, we were only 50% of the way through. It started on the 6th of October. We had 7 weeks of prosecution evidence accusing Shrien Dewani of being involved in the murder of his wife while they were on honeymoon here back in 2010. But 2 weeks ago, his defence team made an application to the judge here to have the whole case thrown out of court. They said the evidence had been so poor, the case against Shrien Dewani was so weak that there was simply no need to defend themselves against it. There was no realistic possibility, they said, of the judge making a conviction here, and the whole thing should be thrown out of court. Well, we spent 13 days wondering exactly what that decision might be, and when we arrived here this morning, it was very unclear what kind of format that might take, whether the judge would deliver her verdict in 5 minutes or whether it would take her all day. And she began by talking about some cases that have happened before here in South Africa. We know now that was to support her final decision. Then she went over a lot of the evidence that we've heard so far here in court. Now, the state's main witness was a man called Zola Tongo, who is already serving a life sentence for the murder of Annie Dewani back in 2010. His evidence over the past few weeks here did seem to be rife with inconsistencies. He seemed to be unsure about certain crucial details, for example, how much he might be paid, at what point they organised the killing of Annie Dewani, who would be involved, where the money in the taxi might be left. Lots of small details, but very important details that seem to add up to a witness that wasn't really credible. Well, it seems that's exactly what the judge had been thinking throughout the trial. She said here this morning that she simply found that evidence to be completely unbelievable, and there was no realistic prospect of a conviction here. Of course, that raises the possibility that there will be no evidence from Shrien Dewani. We now won't hear his side of the story in court. We've never actually heard him say what happened that night, and after this decision there is now no reason for him to do that at all.
And of course, she was absolutely scathing about the evidence that had been given by that main prosecution witness and the other witnesses.
That's right, yeah. There are currently 2 men serving life sentences for Annie Dewani's murder. Zola Tongo, who was the taxi driver on that night back in 2010, and his accomplice, a man called Mzwamadoda Kwabe. Both of them in prison currently, but both of them giving evidence here in court because they are the only 2 people that ever implicated Shrien Dewani in this crime. You have back to November 2010 when the couple came here on their honeymoon. They arrived in Cape Town to stay at a very nice hotel on the waterfront here, the Cape Grace, on the 12th of November 2010. On the evening of the 13th of November, their taxi was travelling through a township on the outskirts of Cape Town here, a shanty town really, when it was apparently hijacked. 2 men jumped in. They dumped the taxi driver Zola Tongo and Shrien Dewani by the roadside, and they drove off, kidnapped Annie Dewani, and she was found dead the next day. Shrien Dewani flew home with his family just a short while later and then was implicated in the crime. He had a nervous breakdown. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, and there was a very long extradition process, 3.5 years, before they finally got Shrien Dewani back over here to South Africa to stand trial, which began in October this year. With the background to this story, here's John Kay.